True Tales of the Rails, Actual Happenings Told by Eyewitnesses. Railroad Magazine, January 1941. Helper Town by Haywire McClintock. When I was cut off the board on the Mormon Division of the Oregon Short Line in December 1912, with a clear record and 6 months seniority, which was unusual for me, the chief clerk apologized and said I'd be rehired as soon as business picked up. That is, if I were still around then. "Oh, I'll be around," I promised, and I meant it, for a job of braking between the Utah capital and Pocatello, Idaho was about as good as any as you'd find in the West at the time. There was plenty of openings for trainmen in the wide open spaces, but most of them ran from no place to no place through nothing, as the boomers put it. And Salt Lake was a lively town to hang out in. It was big enough to play the finest theatrical attractions and yet small enough for you to get acquainted with all the bartenders. Besides, in my humble opinion, Salt Lake City had and still has more pretty girls to the city blocks than any other town in the States or Canada. I had one of them lined up steady there for a while, a blonde with baby blue eyes and hips like a snake's torso. So instead of listening to the far-off whisper of Southern California palm trees, I hired myself to Helper, Utah at the other end of the Salt Lake Division and went to work switching for the Denver and Rio Grande. Helper is a smudge on the landscape on the eastern side of the Washoe Range, just where the Rio Grande rails start to climb over the famous Soldier Summit. To the eastward, the shining steel stretches away from vast reaches of rock and sagebrush country that is almost thinly settled as it was when Brigham Young led his pioneer caravan across what mapmakers term the Great American Desert. To the westward, seeming almost to hang right over the Little Division Point, rise the mighty battlements of the Washoe Range, bellowing locomotives that drag their strings of dingy freight cars up the grade. Through the Castle Gate Canyon are dwarfed into toy size by the gaunt naked cliffs which look down upon their passing. There wasn't much to Helper in those days, just a Ford track yard, a roundhouse, a coal chute, and a rip track for a light repairs to the rolling stock. And yet it was, and is, an important spot in the old D&RG, for hidden away in the canyons nearby are a half a dozen or more of the biggest producing coal mines in the West. Nearly all, including the coke ovens at Sunnyside, were reached by branch lines. A job of breaking out of a helper was worth close to $200 per month, even 27 years ago. The town itself in 1912 and 13 was 1 mile long and 1 street wide, as one boomer expressed it. It had a depot whose upper floor housed the offices of the trainmaster, the chief dispatcher, and the general yardmaster. At the upper end of the station platform was the beanery, while at the lower end or near it stood the railroad YMCA. Main Street consisted of just one big restaurant run by Japanese, 2 or 3 general merchandise emporiums, and 5 or 6 saloons, all of which were practically under the trainmaster's windows. I rented a room in a private house where several other rails were housed. There were 4 bedrooms on the upper floor, all opening off a central lounge room, whose chief article of furniture was a big pot-bellied coal stove, our only source of heat. Showing up on the job for my first night, I found that my companions on the footboard were Jimmy Burns, foreman, and Tom Gadbury, switchman. Tom had worked for the Grand at various points in Colorado and had been Rule Guide half a dozen times, a plea for one more chance after his last blow-up had resulted in a sentence of 6 months on probation at Helper. If Tom stuck it out without getting fired, he had a chance to go back breaking out of Saldina. I never did learn what had put Jimmy Burns on his uppers, for Jimmy was a first-rate car hand and had worked all over the West. But when he hit Helper, just a month ahead of me, he was broke, hungry, without a Brotherhood card or a service letter, and as ragged as a barrel of sauerkraut. Well, that'll give you an idea. Nobody stayed at Helper as night switchman for very long, which made it a swell spot for a boomer to drop off and pick up a road stake. And now Burns, Gadbury, and I, for reasons of our own, were determined to hold her down until spring. My references were in order, but Superintendent J.T. Sattery had several letters about Jimmy Burns. The Denver office wanted him fired for unsatisfactory personal record. Slattery went to bat like the old hero that he was, and Jimmy stayed. We did most of our switching at the east end of the yard, where we made up drags of empties for the various mine runs. Our toughest assignment was that of lining up the local in the morning. The whole yard sloped towards the east on a 1 or 1.5% grade. We kicked our cars up the hill and then watched to see that they didn't roll back on us. I worked the field, carrying a full-grown pick handle to tie down the first cuts that went into an alley, and then checking other cuts that came against him in case the joint didn't make. We used to stop at the rip track on our way down to the east end and load up all the blocks and chunks we could find to wood up the lead. Hobos would come over every chance they got and pack all my timber away for firewood. We got around that by just stopping at the jungles every day, dropping off a half-ton or so of company coal for the boys. There was nothing about the job at Helper to cause any boomer to cease his wanderings. The Utah desert country is no winter resort. It's pleasant enough in daytime when the sun shines down out of a cloudless turquoise sky, but at night the mercury koi retired to the little bulb at the bottom of the thermometer. We considered 15 degrees below zero a rather warm night. As for the town itself, there was no burlesque show, no movie theater, not even a public library. Radio was still to be born. There was a country dance at the schoolhouse every Saturday night, but that was out as far as we knothooks were concerned. About all we did was work, eat, and sleep. 12 hours of toil per night, 7 nights per week. We forgot what a spot signal looked like. Spot, of course, means rest, a chance to sleep, or loaf or gab on company time. On the spot was a common term to indicate chewing the rag, that is, swamping experiences in tall tales. It's now used to the readers of letters departments of Railroad magazine. As I was saying, we had little or no spot in the desolate coal town of Helper, Utah. If it hadn't been for my sweetheart, a slim, starry-eyed young thing in Salt Lake City, I'd have bounced my smoky lantern against the nearest boxcar and grabbed a rattler for the West Coast. Think of her made life at Helper endurable. After heading the Calliope towards the cinder pit of the morning, we used to pick up a bucket of Java at the beanery and adjourn to Old Man Flam's grog shop. There the tomato-faced bartender would have his stove red hot and a bottle of black Jamaica rum spotted on the mahogany. Mister, there were mornings when we were so tired that the dragging seats of our overalls obliterated our tracks in the snow, but 3 or 4 jorums of boiling coffee, generously laced with full-bodied rum and seasoned with sugar, cinnamon, and a twist of lemon peel, would have made us ready to imagine ourselves on the Florida sands. Nothing much happened in Helper beyond the occasional barroom brawl. Overworked coal miners, in for a spree, would tangle with a couple of stray cowboys, but all of them steered clear of railroaders, for the trainman and engineer in the Grande in those days were plenty tough. The miners were muscle-bound and slow, while the cowboys, being restrained by law from carrying their guns in town, were pretty harmless. The first mallets arrived in Helper that winter. Much to the surprise of the brass hats who had brought them in, there wasn't any way to turn them around. Those big babies were something like 40 feet long, than the turntable in the roundhouse. The first one of them that started around the Y at Helper turned the rail over, broke through the ties, and just about buried herself in the cinder ballast. It took the wrecking crew nearly a week to jack her up, build a new railroad under her drivers, and drag her back into the lead. So the mallets cut into the service as Helper engines remained pointed west all winter. Engine crews compelled to back the giants down off the hump against a gale of icy wind hollered blue murder, and the brakeman, who made an easy 10 miles for turning and Helper on the Y at Soldier Summit, joined the chorus. One gin mill at Helper had gambling games to the rear, a roulette game, a Klondike layout, and a blackjack game to pick up the loose change, while a stud poker table supplied plenty of accommodation for any gent who craved action for his money. I became rather chummy with a brakeman named Todd. One evening I dropped into his house of not a chance on my way to work. I bought myself a bottle of beer and was in the act of pouring some into my interior when I caught sight of Todd. He was in the stud game and apparently doing all right, for he was sitting behind a stack of chips that looked like the Great Wall of China. There must have been $500 worth of celluloid in that barricade. I eased over behind him. "Why don't you cash in," I suggested, "and get out while you're a winner?" "I aim to do that little thing," said Todd. Go over and lay off for the night. When you get back, I'll cash in. We'll hire an auto and go into Price. Price was the county seat 7 miles away. It was known as the biggest small town in the world. I headed for the yard office. It took about an hour to dig up a brakeman who was willing to work one night in the yard so I could knock off. When I got back to the joint, Todd met me at the door. "Lend me $20, he said. My friend had won pretty steadily all the afternoon, and then lost the whole works in an hour. Such is a gambler's luck. We went to Price, but was on my dough, not Todd's. The county seat was lively enough to suit anybody. It had a flock of dance halls, honky-tonks, and saloons, and gambling was wide open. There were no honky-tonks in Helper, and the coal camps in the vicinity had no saloons, so Price got the play from the whole district. One of Helper's leading citizens was an ancient celestial called Tom Chinaman. This Mongolian was the last survivor of the coolie gangs that laid the first rails over Soldier Summit, and he raided a job with the DNRG for life. His official title was that of janitor around the company office. He also had to sweep out the waiting rooms and transfer the mail stacks to and from the post office across the street. Mail handling was one of the duties Tom Chinaman never neglected, drunk or sober. An inveterate gambler, he played a mighty tough game of poker. Professional card sharps around Helper were plenty hard to beat, but old Tom used to take them for a ride every once in a while. When he had worked out on the local boys to his own satisfaction, he'd take a trip to Ogden and had matched his skill with luck against the big shots at Chinatown there. Sometimes Chon came back having pockets stuffed with coin, and sometimes he arrived talking to himself, but he enjoyed the smiles of fortune or the bludgeoning adversary with a bland equanimity that nothing could shake. On certain occasions Tom pinned a Berrigan and walked around in a mellow alcoholic glow for days at a time. The frame depot and the upstairs offices included the sanctum of the division superintendent were likely to go unswept for a week, while wastebuckets and cuspidors were unemptied and the windows were crusted with grime. But always Tom managed to get the mail stacks from the depot to the post office and vice versa. In his own eyes, that made everything okay. It was said that every superintendent who ever came to Helper had fired Tom Chinaman, but none of them made it stick. All the Mongolian had to do was get some bartender to write a letter to Denver, and back would come a sizzling telegraphic order for his reinstatement. And the former rail layer would sweep out the offices when he got ready, not before. He lived in a dugout lined with worn-out railroad ties. A dozen or more of these primitive dwellings were dug into the side of the bank deep down below the team track. They were occupied by shopmen, trademen, and other railroaders, and were rather comfortable, being cool in the summer and warm in the winter. Although located on company ground, they were considered private property and were passed along from one owner to another for a cash consideration, usually $15 or $20. The old Celestial finally mounted a dragon some years ago. I was told that his was about the biggest funeral ever held in Helper. DNRG officials served as pallbearers, and the public school system was shut down for the day so the children could pay a final tribute to the pioneer railroader. On the morning of St. Patrick's Day, 1913, a bunch of us boomers foregathered in our favorite groggery to do a bit of drinking in honor of the green sod of Erin that none of us had ever seen. The more red-eyed we imbibed, the more Irish we felt, and finally nothing would serve to round out the day but a parade. I dug out my guitar, a lad named McConnell produced a harmonica, and Todd joined in with a tin flute, while the rest of the gang kept time by banging on sundry buckets and cans. After a few more rounds of drinks and a bit of serious rehearsing, we found that we were able to play the Wearin' of the Green in a highly satisfactory manner. At least it sounded swell to us. Thereupon we marshaled our ranks, and in addition to several rails more or less Irish ancestry, our pageant included Tom Chinaman and a Swede bartender named Christensen, and 3 or 4 Italian coal miners. All of us were slightly wobbly on our pins. We had decorated ourselves liberally with green hatbands and shamrocks cut out of a piece of billiard cloth. Just as the procession was about to get underway, who should come sailing down the street but Maggie Murphy. Maggie, of course, joined in the parade. She was a Denver girl who was a night biscuit shooter in the beanery at Helper. A fine strapping Colin she was, with a mop of coal-black hair a skin like cream and roses, and the biggest, bluest eyes that ever smiled at a hungry railroader across a lunchroom counter. Maggie was that popular. She could probably have married any single man and helper within a week after she hit the town, but she played no favorites, unless it was in the way of giving a little special attention to switchmen. We learned that her father, a member of the Switchmen's Union of North America, had been killed in Pueblo, which made Maggie practically a ward of the night yard crew at Helper. We promenaded the full length of the Helper's main stem back, with a side trip down the long platform past the hash house and the depot. Then the band having blown itself into a state of exhaustion, we had one more drink all around and went to bed. That evening, Jimmy, Gadbury, and I met at the post office and were strolling up the platform towards the beanery for supper when we spotted Maggie perched on a baggage truck with a bulging suitcase beside her. An eastbound passenger train was due in about 30 minutes, and it was quite evident that the donut slinger intended to be on the cushions when the train pulled out. "What's the matter, kid?" I queried. "Has life in the far west suddenly got you down?" "The manager," Maggie replied eloquently, "fired me for marching in that fool parade with you mugs this morning." "But you'd like to stay with us, wouldn't you?" asked Jimmy Burns. "You don't really want to go back to Denver." "I'll tell the world I don't," said the beanery queen. "There's mother and all the young Murphys to be looked after. I was doing all right here. I made enough tips to take care of me personal expenses, and I've been sending all me wages home. And now—" her voice trailed miserably. Maggie's blue eyes were close to tears. Burns and Gadbury and I looked at one another. "Well," said Jimmy, "we got her into it." The cowboy came lopping up the platform. Jimmy halted him with the long arm. "Go upstairs, Sonny, and tell the old man that Helper Yard is tied up. Tell him he has a switch shanty strike on his hands, and he'd better get down here to open negotiations for a settlement." I guess the kid grasped the situation. He shot up the stairs, and in less than a minute, J.T. Slattery, division superintendent, came down the same stairs in about 3 strides. "What's all this?" he demanded. Jimmy outlined the situation. "But," Super protested, "I'm running a railroad, not a restaurant. How can I put the girl back to work?" "Use your influence with the manager," I suggested. "And you better make it snappy," Gadbury added. "That train'll be here in 15 minutes. A word from the old man sent the cowboy scooting up the platform. I don't know what he told the beanery boss, but the lad was back in less than 2 minutes with, "He says tell Maggie to come back to work." "Tell that damn blockhead to come down here and do his own talking," snapped Jimmy. "He fired her, didn't he?" "Now, Jimmy," the super begins. "Listen," Jimmy cut in. "Her name is Murphy. My name is Burns, and—" he paused. "Your name is Slattery, and her old man was a switchman." The brass hat regarded us intently for half a minute. "Okay, boys," he grunted. "You handle it." And he clumped back up the stairs. Jimmy Burns met with the beanery boss halfway up the platform. His instructions must have been very explicit, for I had never heard a handsomer apology than he tendered to Maggie Murphy, nor have I ever eaten so much better meal than Maggie spread in front of us a half-hour later. Evidently we hadn't lowered ourselves any in the estimations of the cook. One night, a month later or so, we were loading the coal chute. Jimmy gave the hogger a signal to take him away, just as I stepped in between 2 cars. His yell of warning saved my life, but it was mighty close. I charged on him with the full intention of wearing out my Tom Moore over his head. Jimmy outran me, and I gave up the chase. Instead, I smashed my lamp against the side of a boxcar and walked off the job. Next morning, Jimmy came around to my room ready to apologize or do battle. I accepted the apology. We had a couple of drinks, and then we went over to see old man. Mr. Slattery gave me an order for my money, a pass to Salt Lake City, and a very nice service letter which I still have. J.T. Slattery was a real man and a real railroader. About a month afterward, I was strolling down Main Street in Salt Lake City. Then who did I meet but Jimmy Burns? "You went away from Helper too soon," he said. "You should have stuck around and left 'em something to remember you by, like we did." Over a couple of beers, I got the story. My place had been taken by young McConnell, a lad who had played the harmonica in our famous parade. On a fine spring evening, the night crew went down to switch the team back to their first chore. Now the team track at Helper was the only track south of the main stem, while the old main was a receiving track for eastbound drags, was the first track north of it. And the last car on the team track was the loaded dynamite for one of the coal camps. It was billed out in the morning local. Jimmy coupled the team track and dragged them all into the main. Then he told young McConnell to mount the car of powder and to ride it down the old main to hold 10 or 12 more. McConnell tried to brake and pronounced it okay. Jimmy come up free. He was just about to turn Gadbury loose on the next cut, returning into the team track, when McConnell came running back up the lead, swinging his lamp in a series of frantic washouts and yelling at the top of his lungs, "That car of powder is gone!" "What the hell do you mean, gone?" shrieked Jimmy. "Where has it gone to?" "I got down about as far as you said to take her," panted McConnell. "The first swing I made at the brake, the chain snapped and I fell clean off the car. Last I saw of her, she was making good time down the old main." Now here is where James Byrne blew his topper entirely. With a shouted order to Gadbury to grab him and ride him, he cut poor Tom loose with everything he had a hold of, some 10 or 12 cars. As soon as the cars cleared the switch, he and McConnell mounted the footboard and set off down the old main in frantic pursuit of the runaway load of 40% dynamite. Poor Brooks, the gray-headed engineer, had no idea what the score was. All he could see was a series of frantic highballs from the footboard, so he widened on the little goat, and away they went. The old man paralleled into the high iron, all the way down through the yard, terminating in a branch line that ran to a coal camp some miles away. There was a crossover at the main line, but the switch was normally set for the branch, thus taking the place of a D-rail to protect the main stem, and this branch line started a fairly swift climb right to that switch. So Jimmy Burns came high-balling down the old main in pursuit of the runaway powder. The powder car ran up the grade on the branch line until gravity halted it. Then it started drifting back again through the darkness, gathering speed en route. The goat had an oil headlight, and not a man of the crew saw that the powder car until they were practically into it. Jimmy made one wild swing with his lantern. He unloaded on one side while McConnell soared into the darkness on the other. The pig mauler hadn't even time to close his throttle before they came together. That little old engine switch was buried deep on the end of a dynamite car. Only an expert in the behavior of high explosives could explain why that dynamite failed to let go. All I can say is if it had gone off there wouldn't have been a man in the crew left alive. The car was busted wide open, of course. Broken boxes and sticks of the deadly stuff were scattered all over the yard. And that wasn't all. The string of cars that Jimmy had cut Gadbury loose with was more than any 3 men could have held. So they ran off the end of the team track, fell over the bank, and spilled out his merchandise. "They'll remember me at Helper for a long time," Jimmy said grimly, signaling the bartender. That was April or May of 1913. Maybe some of the old-timers around Helper still do remember him. Anyhow, in Salt Lake City, I found the starry-eyed blonde waiting for me like I expected. Yes, this was great to be a boomer and rail in those days.